Welcome to the Creepypasta chat room, live here on the Creepypasta Aminos application on the Google App Store. Once again, my friends, I am narrator as well as author and legendary cult horror host, the Keymaster / Poe. Tonight, I will be reading you 13 twisted tales, my friend. And the first story is entitled Night Terror's Prediction. Night terrors. Shane was having them again. Flashbacks of demons emerging out of a blood-stained carpet. Surrounded with candles, it haunted him for years. Being locked in a mental asylum for over 13 years, he began to relive his ordeal day in and day out. It's not so much the appearance of the demon that struck him as odd, but it was what the demon said. The putrid smell of the abomination filled the room. Faint cries and screams followed from the mist coming from the circle. The demon levitated and floated in his direction. The vile creature's face was decayed with maggots falling from the cheek. He came an inch away from the face and began to whisper in his ear. "Thousands of years I have been searching for you," the decrepit demon said. "I have come to give you eternal life." And in a state of shock and stun, Shane felt a surge of magical dark energy flow through his veins. And then a portal opened below their feet, with the screams of the damned echoing in the mist emanating from the portal. The demon grabbed his hand and whispered, "Are you ready to go home, my son?" When he awoke shaking and convulsing, he felt the vomit fill up the back of his throat with large chunks. He began to thrash on the gurney, contorting his body against the restraints. He could not save himself. Shane suffocated on his own vomit and died. And before Shane passed, he heard the faint whisper from the abomination say, "Welcome home." Once again, my friends, thank you for joining us here on the Google Pasta. Thank you, my friends. Once again, everybody in the comment section, thank you for joining us here on the Creepypasta Aminos application for Google. Once again, I am your host this evening, the Keymaster / Poe. Once again, out of my Centerbyte stories. This next story is entitled The Mutilator. He began sawing through the top of the woman's collarbone with a rusty bone saw. The helpless victim, crying and thrashing, barely able to breathe due to the plastic bag covering her head. A sparkle began to shine in his eye. Once again, he was free to do as he pleased. The jury should have set him to the express route to the electric chair for what he has done. But a loophole in the system allowed him to be a free man. Now he remains covered in blood daily. The screams of his victims can be heard through the isolated walls of his bloody shack. Grinning from ear to ear, with the severed limbs of his victims surrounding his feet, His heavy breathing entailed the satisfaction he now feels once again. Cleaning the blood off of his face, he then goes into his room, puts on his collar. He began to recite his prayer, then picks up his Bible and heads to the sermon. Indeed, a very twisted reverend. Once again, my friends, on all the platforms tuning in tonight, we have Facebook, we have YouTube, we have the Google Creepypasta Aminos application. I'd like to say thank you once again for joining us here on the Horrorpasta chat room live. Once again, my friends, this next twisted tale out of my Centibite stories is entitled The Blood Serpent. While Jonathan was impaled on a spike, his vision began to blur and flicker in and out. He yelled out in pain as another spike was inserted into the back and out of his face. He began to thrash violently. It was no use. The jagged metal spike that impaled his semi-conscious body was now buried into the ground as a constant reminder to the people who tread on this land. The man soaked in blood with the serpent crown looked up at the moonlight and raised his sword. From the bottom of his stomach, a beast-like roar echoed over the soldiers in front of him. Jonathan slowly turned to his left to see his brother Ville, lifeless, with a metal spear protruding through the side of his jaw. Breathing heavily and starting to feel tired, Jonathan began to weep silently. With the blood draining out of Jonathan's blood leaking down the spear, the man in the serpent hat put his finger on the bloody spear and wiped it and tasted Jonathan's blood. The man with the serpent crown yelled, "This one will do." 3 of the serpent soldiers said, "Yes, Crimson King." They began setting up a dining room table right underneath Jonathan's impaled feet. A plate and a jagged knife, as well as a fork and wine glass, was set on the table. The man with the Crimson King sat and proceeded to pick up a knife. Walking underneath Jonathan, the Serpent King sliced the back of the Achilles tendon and put his wine glass underneath Jonathan's foot. The cup began to fill with blood. Jonathan see the top of the man's crown, and he heard the man drink from his cup. A loud roar echoed over the army from the Crimson King's mouth. Blood is the life, and life is the blood. Jonathan began convulsing one last time before fading to black. The Serpent King drank the blood of the thousands of men. Jonathan was only one. Poor Jonathan. It is a sad tale to have your blood drinking while you are alive. But once again, thank you for joining us here on all platforms. Once again, I am the Keymaster /Poe, and our next story is entitled No Place Like Home. Shadows shifting back and forth with the sounds of heavy breathing. The cries can be heard muffled under the duct tape. The 3 victims suspended upside down, patiently waiting for their fate. The door crept open. The sounds of footsteps got louder as the butcherman entered the room. The faint sounds of screaming are heard, causing the grin to widen on the face of the butcherman. Slicing the sharp blade faster than an eye can blink, cutting the duct tape from the first victim's mouth. Releasing the blood-curdling screams of pain and agony, the blade begins to talk to him, guiding his every motion with precision, slicing. Both of the ears from the head are removed, the nose quickly in one movement. Suspended upside down from the ceiling, the victims began to thrash and scream, blood-curdling cries of mercy. The victim cries and tries to negotiate his fate by offering large amounts of money. But the butcher man knows what evil this man holds in his heart, and quickly declines the offer with a fast decapitation with his blade. With the blood gurgling and spewing from the jugular, the agnostic breathing takes hold and the man dies. Placing the first severed head onto the pot of boiling water, the butcher man looks to the other 2 suspended victims and says, "There's no place like home. Are you ready to go now?" And with that, he pressed record on the video camera and started the chainsaw. Indeed, my friends, that is a awkward predicament right there, my friends. Being severed, as well as watching your pals be cooked. Once again, thank you for joining us here on the Creepypasta chat room. And once again, I see you all in the comments section. And I say thank you for joining us. Our next little centerbite story is entitled Hearing Aid. The smell of burnt flesh lingered in the enclosed room. Boris, drenched in sweat, laughing hysterically, twitching at the excitement. "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" he asked over and over as he repeatedly placed the immense flame of the blowtorch on her ear. His neighbor Elaine, such a sweet, innocent woman, always kind and caring, offering him food when she knew he had none. She just picked the wrong night to bring him leftover pizza. Boris was a serial killer. He loved to torture. He loved to mutilate and degrade his victims. Boris was preoccupied in his weekly frenzy to hear the doorbell ring. Elaine rang the doorbell 3 times. She knew his apartment was small enough to hear the bell. She found it rather odd that he was not answering. When the faint, muffled screams could be heard behind the door, Elaine panicked. Dropping the pizzas and pushing the door open to see if Boris was okay, she opened the door to find Boris, as well as his room, bed and clothing covered in blood. Body parts were hanging from the ceiling like decorations. A convulsing man laid strapped to the bed, with jumper cables and electrodes strapped to his genitals and face. sheer terror crept over Elaine's face with a quick instinctive jolt for the door. But Boris was already at her throat before she could move. With an animal-like instinct, Boris began biting and headbutting the face and eyes of Elaine until she lost consciousness. She woke to the smell of burning flesh, as well as an immense sensation on her ears. Glancing up, she could notice Boris in one hand and a blade in the other. He was drenched in sweat, laughing hysterically, mutilating his own stomach and chest. When he noticed she was awake, he began to repeat, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" Indeed, can you hear me now? Once again, thank you for joining us in our Creepypasta chat room. Indeed, I hope you all are enjoying my Centerbyte stories. And once again, everybody in the comments section, thank you for tuning in. Our next little story of mine is a western tale about Maniac Jack Bellow. So once again, this is entitled Gallows Walkers. From the beginning of time, there has been vigilante justice. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Outlaws in the Old West were known to be quite fearless and ruthless on the plains. The Bellow Gang were notorious for hanging and violently torturing innocent people. Jack Bellow, the mastermind of the outfit, and barked orders like a rabid wolf to execute and entertain his morbid fantasies. He became known as Maniac Jack Bellow in the Wild West, spreading fear coast to coast. He has turned populated cities into ghost towns overnight, leaving hundreds of corpses hanging from buildings and trees as far as the eye can see. Waking early one morning, the Bellow Gang was discussing the next town to exterminate when the loud sound of gunfire erupted all around them, and shouting in the hills began. "They're over here! I see them!" In a hail of bullets and commotion, the Bellows were surrounded before they had a chance to pull their own pistols. "We got the drop on them," one of them shouted on horseback. A cold shiver went down the back of Maniac Jack. He knew at that moment the jig is up, and that he will have his date with the gallows himself. They rounded up Jack as well as handcuffed and dragged them for 10 miles. Back at the West Junction jail, all of the men were corralled into a cell like cattle, given a tale of brown water and moldy bread for the night. In the morning, they were to be tried and hanged. Everybody in the West knows of Maniac Jack and the Bellow Gang. There was no shortage of townspeople when the hearing was held. The gavel fell as the judge, in a furious rage, handed out their death sentences. "You are all to be hanged now," the judge shouted. The blindfolds placed over their heads and marched directly up the gallows stairs. 8 nooses were set around the necks of the Bellow Gang, the executioner pulling tightly on Jack's noose. He replies, "Are you gallows walkers ready to walk in eternity?" Before Jack could respond, he pulled the lever, snapping the necks of all 8 members. People say Jack was the devil in the flesh, and with a body count of 1,385 victims, I will have to say they are right. Indeed. The infamous maniac Jack Bellow and the Bellow gang hanging around for eternity. Once again, thank you for joining us here in the Horror Pasta chat room. I am your humble cult horror host and narrator, as well as author, the Keymaster /Poe. Our next little story is about a man deranged who has a fetish for murdering clowns. Once again, this little story is entitled The Red Nose. The blood began to turn brown underneath the fingernails of Andrew Blip. For 2 weeks, he stalked the circus anxiously. Shaking nervously, he thought, what a rush. He loved hiding behind the circus tent with his baseball bat in hand. Philip was always patient when it came to murdering clowns. The sounds of coughing and hacking filled the air, and out of the corner of his eyes, he seen the flickering of a cigarette into the air. The unsuspecting clown didn't know what hit him. After the vicious beating, Philip whispered, 10 more to go. While spitting on the corpse, leaning down, he slapped the face of the clown. Philip smiled. Grabbing a fistful of matted orange hair, he began yanking violently, chuckling to himself. He began to shake harder and harder with every step. Got another red nose, Philip shouted from the top of his lungs. Dragging the corpse of the clown into the kitchen of his house, he began to laugh hysterically. Behind the microwave, he pulled out an ore cigar box. Jumping up and down, slapping and hitting his knee like a drunken hillbilly, Philip opened the box. Inside was the severed red noses of 9 different clowns, alongside a straight razor. Casually humming the Andy Griffith theme song, he took the sharp blade and severed the nose of the clown. He began to hold it up to the light and examine it. He wiped the sweat from his brow and put the nose into the box. 10 more to go, he thought to himself. Indeed, those pesky clowns won't be sniffing around here no more. Once again, thank you for joining us here on the Horror Pasta chat room. I am your humble horror host and narrator, as well as author, the Keymaster /Poe. And once again, our next twisted tale is definitely dying to kill. This little story is about a deranged man worshipping serial killers who one day ventures into the world to claim and start his heinous acts and ends up crossing a serial killer himself. So once again, enjoy this twisted tale entitled Dying to Kill. Alfred Zane was obsessed with true crime. He started reading about some of the most notorious serial killers and mass murderers in history. He spent countless days and nights studying crime scene photos and going over forensic science technique, as well as researching all of the greats: Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Albert Fish, and Jeffrey Dahmer. He became so infatuated, he began to collect animal bones like Jeffrey Dahmer. He also began to acquire a taste for sticking needles in his groin like Albert Fish. He became a sexual deviant. He began watching extreme violent pornography to be infatuated like Ted Bundy. He made up his mind that he was going to be a serial killer. Since he had a clear idea of what he wanted to do, he began pondering with a name. He said, "I am the A to Z killer. I will kill victims in alphabetical order, A to Z, until I get caught." He began grabbing a phone book and started looking for potential victims. He began looking through the A section of the phone book, looking for the closest prospect to his house. He took his finger and pointed to a name: Amber Redding, 322 North Pisco Street, which is only a few blocks from where he lived. He quickly started to premeditate his every move and calculate what needed to be done to carry out his heinous act. He began to stalk her like a tiger, eager to pounce on his prey, watching her every movement, knowing her daily routines. He did this for 2 weeks, just to make sure. Grocery store, then right home to unload. He knew the neighbors would be gone as well. This was his chance. She began to unload her groceries in her garage when she felt a sharp instrument to her throat and a deep voice. "You scream and I'll gut you," Alfred said with a harsh whisper. Her only reply she could muster was, "Now, why would I do that?" With a quick jolt, she pulled a 9mm from her waist, turned and immediately fired 3 times into the chest and sternum of Alfred. Without warning, Alfred was down on the ground, bleeding profusely and breathing heavily. She began to laugh and sing and began to dance around Alfred in a circle. Without warning, she stopped in turn and said, "Out of all days, you decide to rob somebody, you pick a serial killer." She lifted the 9mm, walked slowly to Alfred, and began to whisper under her breath unrecognizable words. She was about 2 inches away from Alfred's face when she pulled the trigger, and in a faint whisper, she said, "Victim 62. Indeed. Out of all days, Alfred, he decides to rob a serial killer. A female killer, nonetheless. But once again, I say thank you for joining us here on the Creepypasta chat room live. Thank you, my friends. This next twisted tale is about a man who is infatuated with his high school sweetheart. But this story is very, very different from anything you've ever heard. This is entitled Dead Butterfly. Dragging the lifeless corpse of Jennifer Tate by a hook in her mouth, Big Grim Tim heard the faint melodies of demons singing in his mind. This was his day of reckoning, yanking and pulling the corpse of his high school sweetheart in a brutal fashion to her final resting place. He began to relive the memories of when Jennifer would talk to him in public. After his brain injury, he began to claim to hear voices and feel electrical currents running through his body. With his brain injury as well as the kids picking on him at school, he began to let his appearance go. His big yellow teeth and black frizzy hair began to stand out more each day. When he would arrive at school, Tim would sit in the bathroom stall just to avoid his classmates. They would always make fun of Tim, laughing, making fun of his teeth and hair. They circled him like a pack of hyenas, heckling to one another. He must have ate a pound of butter, Cindy James remarked. Sean Meadows, the high school quarterback, pushed him from the back, making him lose his balance and smacking his face into the water fountain. A flashing jolt of electricity went through his body. He began to shake uncontrollably, slowly clenching his locker, rising to his feet. The crowd suddenly began to step back as a blue flame evolved from his body and incinerating Sean Meadows. Only Sean's retainer from his teeth was left on a pile of ash. Cindy James and the rest of Beaumont High began to flee. Screaming in panic, the senior class of '86 sprinted for the closest exit. In a controlled fit of rage, Grim Tim muttered under his breath, and what the blue flame formed around his head sprouted a dark black top hat. With another faint whisper, a greenish blurry grow hook grew from the hand of his smoky palm. He swung his hook like a blade from a ceiling fan, hitting Cindy James in the chest. She began to cry in pain and kick as she was lifted off of her feet. With a faint whisper, Tim Yellow's teeth began to sprout even larger, as well as the shape of his jaw. It grew open larger, stretching open to the size of a basketball. Like a human kebab, Grim Tim placed the head of Cindy James in his mouth and bit down like a crocodile. Blood gushed from the jaws of Tim, and the gurgling sound was sweet music to his ears. In a state of shock, some of the students stopped and stared in disbelief at what they were watching. Grim Tim let the lifeless corpse of Cindy hit the floor. He flew forward with a burst of light, striking 3 more students on his hook, and then flew off to his murder room. With a loud thud, they crashed through the side of the wall of the abandoned building. He wanted peace and quiet, and time alone with these special 3 students. Dusting off of his top hat, he looked over at the 3 students he knew well. Rufio Mendoza was his tormentor from kindergarten. He had his eye on him for many years, plotting his demise. As well as Mallory Pliskin, tormented Grim Tim day in and day out for 3 years. Last but not least, the girl that captivated his attention, the one that gave him butterflies, Jennifer Tate was the only girl in school to say hi to Grim Tim. As the three classmates were breathing heavily with the puncture wound bleeding from their chest, trying to fathom what has just happened, Rufio yelled out, "You freak! I'm going to kill you!" Staggering to his feet, Rufio lunged for Grim Tim's hook, and in a blink of an eye, a green smoke emerged around the head and face of Rufio, suffocating him. His eyes bulged as his tongue began to protrude through his teeth. Rufio was frozen and could not move. The green energy was unbreakable. Grim Tim began to circle around the corpse of Rufio. With a fast jolt from the hook, it entered the stomach, lodging into his small intestines. Grim Tim began engulfed once again in the blue flame, and pulled the hook straight out, bringing blood and intestines from the corpse of Rufio. He fell to the floor, dead as a doornail. He glanced over to Mallory Pliskin and laughed a sinister chuckle. He began to mock Mallory, pucking up his duck lips, while a pile of intestines in his hand. Grim Tim replied, "This would make a great picture on my wall." Jennifer Tate covered her face and tried to regain her breathing from the large wound in her chest. With a burst of energy, Mallory tried to escape the abandoned building by jumping from a nearby window. Halfway out the window, Big Grim Tim threw his top hat that mutated into a glowing guillotine. Her torso was ripped in half by a large blade protruding from the brim of his hat. The top part of the shoulder bent back and her head touched her ankles. With a burst of laughter, Grim Tim shouted, "Don't get bent out of shape." He kneeled down, dripping 2 fingers into the pool of blood. He tasted the taste of satisfaction. The blue flame surrounding his body began to change colors and was now a bright red with a black outline. The butterflies were gone and only malice remained. Jennifer Tate glanced up just to see Grim Tim surrounded by the red flaming gaze. He whispered to her, "Take my hand," and raised his hook to her for the taking. She began to cough up blood and held her wound tightly on her stomach. She slowly lifted her hands as Grim Tim spun around and caught her face with the jagged emerald hook. "You're the cat of the day," he said with a deep, low voice. He had a special place for her. He began yanking her by the face into the cellar of the abandoned building. There he would cast the incantation that would transfer Jennifer's soul into Grim Tim's black jaw. He recited the ancient words, and a spirit-like force began to emerge from her chest. Grim Tim became filled with joy, the flames changing colors surrounding his body. He opened his black glass jar, and the energy from Jennifer's chest filled the jar. Big Grim Tim closed it tightly, and with that, he threw the jar into the air, opened his jaws wide, and with his snarling yellow teeth, and consumed his dead butterfly. Indeed, my friend. hopefully you enjoyed that little twisted tale of the dead butterflies. Once again, thank you for joining us here on the Creepypasta chat room, live. Once again, on all platforms, I say thank you to YouTube, to the Creepypasta Aminos application on Google, as well as Facebook and Instagram. Once again, follow us on Instagram under Butcher Media, as well as subscribe to the Deadvault Horror Show on YouTube. And once again, this next twisted tale is entitled The Doll Axe Dance. Phallus's arms began to ache with every swing. This was his first attempt to mutilate a corpse with a dull axe. He did not know that it would take this long. He was on his 53rd swing of the axe when finally one of the woman's ankles came off. Swiping the sweat from his brow, he began to feel exhausted. He figured if he worked one part of her leg, something would give. After the 68th whack, his wrist began to burn, and he felt his shoulders becoming stiff. The flesh was still clinging loosely to the bone of the woman's thigh. Phallus became irritated. He began to clench his fist and jump up and down, stomping the face of the corpse. "Your flesh is mine," Phallus screamed, breaking the jaw of the mutilated woman. Breathing heavily, Phallus bent down and began sniffing the woman's face. The big yellow eyes of Phallus opened wide when he began to lick the woman's face. Shaking uncontrollably, he rose to his feet with his dull axe in hand and began to swing violently at the corpse. With every swing, the dull axe left smashed flesh and deep gashes. Thick purple blood began to pool around the woman's body. Phallus began to rub his genitals in a disgusting look in his eye. He was on his 111th whack when finally the woman's leg fell off. He began to pick up the severed limbs and began to play air guitar as he was playing to Detroit City. "Good night, everyone," he shouted from the top of his lungs. He dropped the severed limbs and picked up the dull axe. He began to swing furiously once again. 182 whacks in, and he finally decapitated the woman. As Phallus chuckled, he took 4 steps back, ran and kicked the severed head of the woman into the fireplace. "Gold!" he shouted. Engulfed in flames, the woman's head began to singe and crackle. The smell of overcooked flesh began to fill the room. Phallus became blood drunk. He began swinging furiously at the woman's mutilated corpse. With a foot missing, as well as a good portion of her shoulder, some parts of her body began to look like red sludge. In a frenzy, Phallus began licking the blood off the axe. Chewing on the severed ear of the woman, Phallus loved cartilage like bubble gum. Phallus began convulsing and twitching with excitement. Sweating profusely, he was now 387 whacks into his mutilation dance. After 731 whacks with the dull axe, he began to make flat indentions into the woman's flesh. But For no particular reason, Phallus enjoyed mutilating women. When there was only a pile of shredded tenderized flesh soaked in blood, Phallus licked his axe one last time. He began to remove the woman's face with a buck knife. Putting the woman's mutilated face over his own, Phallus began to shake violently and imitate the mutilated woman's voice.
Again, welcome to the Creepypasta chat room, my friends. That was the Dolax dance, with Phallus trying to mutilate a corpse with a dull axe. I could only imagine how many whacks it takes to get to the center. But once again, thank you all in the comments section for joining us here on the Google App Store under the Creepypasta Aminos application, as well as YouTube and Facebook. Once again, this next twisted tale is entitled The Butcher's Way. The imposters trembled and started to sweat profusely. The reputation of the butcher man was legendary. 6 of the hooded men with cleavers' eyes fell upon the butcher. He entered the room breathing heavily, spattered with blood. His cleaver shining brighter than the rest in the room. His blood-soaked hood and gigantic frame made him intimidating to the rest. One of the hooded men began to speak. "We are the butchers of the lost," he said, with a quivering voice. Without warning, the 6 men drew their cleavers and began to circle the butcher man. The blood-soaked hood of the butcher man began to twitch. His shoulder raised with every breath. In an instant, the 6 men pounced on the butcher man, violently swinging their hatchets. A screaming mist began to swirl around the butcher man, protecting the blows. Befuddling the other hooded men with the itty smoke swirling around the blood-soaked butcher man, they began to swing wildly into the smoke, trying to connect with their cleavers. The smoke began to swirl furiously, blinding the other 6 men. With one swipe in a circular motion from front to back, the smoke dissipated and a calm filled the air. The butcher man gathered the 6 decapitated heads and raised his fist in triumph. Often imitated, the ways of the butcher was learned. Once again, thank you for joining us here on the Creepypasta chat room. That twisted tale was entitled The Butcher's Way. Next we have another little tale entitled Strangleland. It's been 10 days since the retirement home bus went missing with 13 senior citizens on board. It was supposed to be a simple trip to Las Vegas and then back to Los Angeles. Halfway into the trip, in a deserted area, they hit a pothole and blew a left front tire. The bus driver said, "Remain calm," to everybody. "It's just a flat tire. I will have it fixed in a minute, and we will be on our way." Tim Gavel, better known as Big Grim Tim, the bus driver, was known for his towering frame and scraggly black hair. With an appearance like Lurch from Adam's Family, he was very intimidating as well as shy. The bus lifted 3 feet when Tim walked off the bus to check the tire. The old man and woman would heckle about how he stunk and how insufferable his music was on the trip. They began to even make remarks about his teeth and hair, asking him, "Hey Sonny, why don't you get a haircut? Hey boy, do you need a toothbrush?" Tim was very shy and sensitive. His towering frame was intimidating to most. The senior citizens on board were not afraid of anything. They were some of the most ruthless senior citizens in Beverly Hills. Each senior citizen on this bus was very rich and very well corrupt. Outside of the bus, Tim began to change the tire when out of nowhere he was blindsided by a piece of concrete from the oncoming car. It hit him and knocked him back, gashing a nice foam on his brow. Blood began running down his face. He began to hear a loud ringing sound, as well as visions of mutilated corpses and human sacrifices. An uncontrollable desire crept over him like a spider. He began having flashbacks of the senior citizens heckling him, criticizing him and degrading him. He started to shake, as well as the ringing intensified in his ears. He sat up from the ground and walked directly back onto the bus. Janet DeLong loved to degrade everybody. As soon as Tim laid eyes on her, her first words were, "You need a Band-Aid, baby?" As the blood spewed down Tim's face, a flashing white light burst into his mind like a volcano erupting. When Tim opened his eyes, he seen all the faces of the senior citizens looking at him in disgust and curiosity. To their amazement, the inside of the bus began to shift and change into a circus tent. A putrid smell began to fill the air inside of the bus. Big Grim Tim was now fully engulfed in a blue flame with a top hat and staff in hand. He shouted from the top of his lungs, "Welcome to Strangleland!" And with a snap of his fingers, the seat belts from their seats wrapped tightly around each one of their throats. Grim Tim began parading up and down the aisles like a marching band, mocking the senior citizens with their own words. "Want a toothbrush?" he chuckled in a high-pitched Jamaican voice. He began dancing around in circles, and evidently all the passengers were all hanging by their safety straps, and all 13 citizens kicking and thrashing, choking to death. Parading up and down the aisles, he began to sing, "Welcome to Strangleland." Indeed, my friends, a twisted tale, welcoming you on that journey to Strangleland. But once again, I say thank you for joining us on the Creepypasta Aminos application, as well as YouTube and Facebook. Tonight, we end our What a Pasta chat room with a dark, twisted tale entitled The Light. It was just another Sunday. Reverend Michael Jeffers was the most enthusiastic reverend I have ever met.
always smiling and patting people on the back. "The Lord is good," he would always say. "It looks like the whole gang is here." You had the Paxtons from next door, as well as the Griffins and Abernathy family gathering inside the door of the church. People began to say hi to one another and give hugs. The organs began to play and everybody took their seats. Reverend Michael picked up his Bible and began to read. "Behold, I cast you out sheep amidst the wolves." His eyes always lit up when he was on a roll, running up and down the aisle screaming, "Hallelujah!" Not one person in the church was sitting. Everybody was dancing and singing. I felt like I was dreaming when I heard the loud sound of automatic weapons. Boom, 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 like a loud drum. An elderly gentleman in the back yelled from the top of his lungs, "Get on your knees!" It took me a second to process what was going on. Once again the man repeated, "Get on your knees now." And with that, I felt the butt of the gunman's AK-47 crack the back of my skull. With that, I dropped to the ground holding my bleeding head. The elderly gentleman held up his gun in one hand and a Bible in the other. He pointed his automatic weapon at us and said, "Today, I show you the light of God." I looked to the left of my pew, seeing Cindy and Jeff Griffin dead from gunshot wounds to the face and neck. Janet Griffin, age 5, began to cry hysterically, holding her dead parents. I then looked to the right of me to see the entire Abernathy family riddled with bullets, bleeding with Bibles in hand. I began to feel dizzy. I vomited and looked towards the direction of the gunman. He made eye contact with me and said, "Is this your family of God?" Breathing heavily, I responded, "Yes, please do not hurt my family." The gunman cracked a smile and said, "Don't worry, my son. I am here to show you the light." My 8-year-old son Devin began to cry, gripping my leg. My wife Lynette grabbed my shoulder and squeezed and said she loved me. "Are you children of God?" the gunman asked. I looked up with tears in my eyes and said, "Yes." The gunman in all black, brandishing the AK-47, lifted his gun, aimed it directly at my family and I, and in a rapid burst of gunfire, the gunman squeezed the trigger, and a burst of light flashed, and then everything faded to black. Indeed, everything fades to black, my friends. I hope you enjoyed that awkward, evil situation. Once again, I am your horror host, narrator and author, the Keymaster / Poe, and I say thank you to all of you in the comments section. Make sure to subscribe to the Deadbolt Horror Show on YouTube, as well as the Creepypasta Aminos application on the Google App Store. Once again, from the depths below, into the fog we go.